So good evening from Cambridge, and I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Dehlia Umunna. I am a clinical law professor at Harvard Law School, where I am also the deputy director for the Criminal Justice Institute, which is one of the premier criminal defense clinics in the country. I have the privilege of supervising and teaching students how to represent indigent men and women in the state of Massachusetts. So welcome to this very important event that we have planned for you this evening. I will not belabor the point. We will get directly into this program that is titled "It's a Crime Using Technical Violations to Re-Incarcerate Individuals." So why is this important? Why are we having this particular program at this time? It is particularly important because you might find it interesting, but it's a fact that the United States makes up about 4% of the world's population, and yet we incarcerate 25% of the world's population. Let that sink in for a minute. We represent only 4% of the world's population, and we incarcerate about a quarter, 25% of the world's population. That should make you shudder. And at any given time, we have men and women, specifically men and women of color, who are under the constant scrutiny, under the guise of being under parole and being supervised under probation. We've been told that in a 2019 report, the Council of State Governments found that 45% of state prison admissions were due to violations for probation or parole. So the question is, what is parole and what does a technical violation mean? What exactly is that? We do know that parole is a form of early release in which the remainder of one's sentence is served in the community under supervision. You might already know this, but it is important to understand that those under supervision have to meet an average of 10 to 20 conditions every single day, every day. Sometimes they often called to drug test. They have to pay a monthly supervision fee. They endure warrantless searches. They have to pay court costs even when they're unemployed. They are subjected to lie detector tests. They have to do counseling, attend AA and NA meetings, and often have to engage in court-ordered treatment. And then they are told that they have to find employment within a specified period of time and cannot associate with others who have arrest records, generally people with whom they are in their neighborhoods. So a technical violation is not brothers and sisters get violated, not because they've committed a crime, but simply because they cannot afford to adhere to some of these onerous conditions that have been set for them. So today's discussion actually will focus on what that really means, what impact it has for our brothers and sisters who are unfortunately in the system. We have an excellent panel for you today. Our keynote will be delivered by Emily NaPier Singletary and Derek Singletary, and they both co-founders and co-executive directors of Unchained New York. I will get to that in a minute. But I thought it was important to let you know that the event that we're doing today is part of a month of national and state actions marking the 49th anniversary of the Attica prison uprising and calling urgent attention to the need for mass decarceration during COVID-19. We were going to get into a little bit more of this very shortly. We do have an excellent panel for you, individuals whom you will hear from once we hear from our keynote speaker. And as I said, our keynote speakers today are Emily NaPier Singletary and brother Derek Singletary. both are co-founders of and co-executive directors of Unchained in New York. Now, Brother Derek has a lifetime of experience fighting oppression and is currently incarcerated in the New York State prison system. And while he's in there, he's pursuing his bachelor's degree from inside the walls. Sister Emily has worked to dismantle systems of punishment for over 15 years as an organizer, an advocate, a researcher, and an educator. And together, they are bridging the gap between prison and community to help build a more powerful movement. So please do join me in welcoming Sister Emily Singletary and her husband and partner, Brother Derek Singletary. And once we hear from them, we will then introduce to you the panelists. I want to remind you, and maybe I should pause here, to welcome each and every one of you. It's my understanding, as I see the activity, the fervent activity going on in the chat room, that we have people from all over the country. So welcome from far and wide. Welcome to this event. We welcome you. If you have questions, please be sure to put them in the Q&A section, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Ms. Singletary, who will deliver our keynote address. And once she is done, I will introduce the rest of this wonderful panel that we have for you today. So as you're thinking of questions, please make sure that you are writing them down. We promise, at least I promise, that we will get to as many of them as possible. Sister Singletary, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dehlia. Derek and I are really honored to be a part of this. We really want to thank the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, the Coalition for Effective Public Safety, and the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism for hosting this really important event. And we want to thank all of you who are tuning in for it from all over the country. I think it's a really important discussion to be having, particularly in the midst of the COVID pandemic and in the midst of the defund the police movement. So really thrilled to be here. As Dehlia said, Derek and I co-founded an organization called Unchained that is based in Syracuse, New York. For people who are unfamiliar with New York geography outside of New York City, that's about 4 hours northwest of New York City, right in the center of the state of New York, where there is not a lot of this kind of organizing around issues in the criminal legal system happening. And at Unchained, because Derek is in state prison and I'm out here in the community, we really do try to bring people together from behind the wall, people who are currently incarcerated, as well as formerly incarcerated people and the loved ones who have supported people or are currently supporting people in jail and prison, and bring them into this movement, because we believe that the people who have lived through this system are the people best positioned to know exactly what's wrong with it and what needs to be done to transform it. We are an explicitly abolitionist organization. We have a mission to dismantle the carceral state in all its forms, all its many forms. And as an abolitionist organization, you know, that means that we really try to envision a world without police, without jails and prisons, and without parole and probation officers who often get left out of that abolition discussion. And we are, you know, because Dehlia mentioned that this is tied to the anniversary of the Attica uprising, I do want to mention that our organization does have strong ties to that as well. Several members of our team at Unchained were members of the Attica Brothers defense team back in 1971 and the years following. And then in 2016, on the anniversary of the Attica uprising, Derek actually participated in a protest in prison and served more than 3 months in solitary confinement as a result of his political activity in prison. So we honor the Attica brothers who led that uprising back in 1971. So we are here to talk about Parole, and Unchained co-leads a campaign in New York State, along with our partners, the Cattell Center for Health, Equity, and Justice, and A Little Piece of Light. We lead a campaign called the Less is More campaign to advance a bill in particular, but also build a broader movement around dismantling parole as we know it. So the bill is called the Less is More Community Supervision Revocation Reform Act. It's currently pending in the New York State Legislature, and it gets that name from a report issued by the Columbia Justice Lab, one of our research partners in the campaign. And that report back in 2018 described how across the country, jail and prison populations, and in the state of New York, jail and prison populations have been falling in pretty much all categories except for one, and that is people being returned to jail or prison for parole violations. That category of people has been increasing in recent years rather than decreasing with the rest of the trend. And so if we're going to talk about decarceration, jail and prison closures, and ultimately talk about abolition, we can't do that without talking about the role that parole and other forms of community supervision play in driving our incarceration crisis. So to start talking about our work in New York, I'm going to play some audio from Derek. Obviously, there are limitations to how he can participate being in prison right now, and he can't be here live with us, but we did record some audio remarks from him over the phone. And so I want to play the first segment of those. And so let me just bear with me while I share my screen here and get his audio playing.
Hello, my name is Derek Singletary. I'm the co-founder and co-executive director of Unchained. I'm currently incarcerated, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about experience on parole. I find that many times I've been asked by people who come to jail, but have never been on supervision, what's the worst part of being on parole? Evidence that we really worry about community supervision before we ever get on it. And so in that same vein, the only logical answer I can give to that question is that the worst part of being on parole is being on parole because it mentally inhibits and has psychological effects that can corrode, resolve, and corrupt dispositions. The way parole and post-release supervision are crafted, a parolee can go back to jail for just about anything. Since most parolees face up to 2 years of reincarceration for committing offenses that aren't even crimes, what's also known as violations, like being late for curfew, missing a treatment appointment, and even having a simple conversation with somebody who has been convicted of a felony, even though last time I checked, people don't just go around announcing that they have felonies. Then for a lot of parolees, it isn't a question of if they're going back to jail, but when. And so just the continuous threat of reincarceration day in and day out produces a psychological burden that all parolees have to deal with. A psychological burden that many times fosters a disposition of relegation, which we sometimes see manifest when we say things like it is what it is. The pressure of having the bar of standards lifted so high above what normal society is held to, even though many of us may be used to performing at a much lower level, is like asking a 5th grader to pass a 12th grade exam. It's not only unfair, it's unjust. We have to first remember how hard it is for parolees without parole, which is already a direct manifestation of institutional racism. That's things like limited housing options, employment discrimination, and many times education deficiencies. when you add the burden of having the bar raised for you as you traverse these hurdles, then a lot of people revert back to old habits because many times it's simply too hard to try and become a productive member of society. That's mental, and it's not an accidental or unintended side effect either. This is a purposeful tactic of yet another level of institutional racism, a method that, if we trace back in our history, has always sought to control the mind in order to control the body. And that type of mental warfare and oppression is to be stopped immediately, especially since these forms of supervision masquerade as rehabilitory programs when they're really designed to reincarcerate. We can't be fooled, and we won't be fooled. Powerful minds will always overcome. It isn't just what it is. It has always been what we make it. So let's change it. Y'all for Perez 2036. Thank you for your time.
That was, he was giving a shout out to Yara Shahidi at the end there. So let me just stay on my shared screen for a minute just to give a little context about what parole violations look like here in New York compared to Massachusetts, where the panelists are, and how this fits into sort of the national landscape. So New York has just really a disproportionate number of people both under supervision and going back to jail and prison as a result of technical violations compared to the rest of the country. In New York, we send almost 9,000 people on parole back to prison every year. Only about 1,300 of those have been convicted of a new crime. So that means the remaining 7,500 people, 85% of the people that parole sends back to prison are sent back for those technical violations, the things that are not crimes, the things like missing curfew. And that's more than any other state in the country, the number of people that New York sends back every year. If you compare this to Massachusetts, Massachusetts sends about 520 people on parole back to prison every year. 450 of those are sent back for technical violations. So just to compare this, New York has about 2.8 times the adult population as Massachusetts, but we send almost 17 times more people back to parole for technical violations than Massachusetts does. So you see a huge disparity there in the number of people that New York is sending back. And then if we look nationally, about 60,000 people every year are sent back to prison for these technical violations. So New York makes up about 13% of those people being sent back to prison for technical violations across the country, even though we only make up about 7% of the country's adult population. You see these disparities in terms of race as well, just like we do at every point in our criminal legal system. So in New York, Black and Latinx people are subject to parole supervision at 6.8 and 2.5 times the rate of whites, respectively. And Black people are returned to prison for technical violations at 5 times the rate of whites. Latinx people are 30% more likely than whites to be sent back for a technical violation. And these racial disparities are significantly wider than they are in the rest of the country. So not only are our numbers in New York higher than the rest of the country, but our racial disparities are wider than they are in the rest of the country. And just a note about the fiscal impact of this, we've done some calculations with our partners here in New York and estimate that New York State spends over $600 million per year locking up people accused of technical parole violations. They account for more than a third of the people going into our state prisons every year in New York. So more than 1/3 of the people we're sending to state prison every year have not been convicted of a new crime. They're just going in for one of these technical violations, and it's costing us over $600 million per year just in the state of New York. So this is why we crafted this bill called the Less is More Act, along with our partners who I already mentioned, Katal, A Little Piece of Light, and the Columbia Justice Lab, and also the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, who played a really key role in helping us draft this legislation. And I'm going to let Derek explain for a minute what that bill would do.
So a few things that Less is More would do is, for one, if you do get a violation, you won't be going directly to jail, which is really what happens now. You don't really have to have any proof. There is a very low burden of proof to actually have you arrested and put in jail, and you could be sitting there for a very long time trying to prove your case or disprove theirs. So the fact that we wouldn't just be automatically assumed guilty like we are right now, I think is very big for us. Another aspect of it is the 30/30, which is basically when you, as you do or as you complete 30 days without a violation, then you get another 30 days off of your time. So obviously, if you go through your whole time without a violation, your post-release supervision or parole will be cut in half. And lastly, you wouldn't be going back to jail for most texts anyway. So fraternizing, talking to somebody who has a felony, being late for curfew, dirty urine, all these things that aren't crimes would no longer send us back to jail. And in the rare case that someone did go back to jail, you would never go back for more than 30 days.
So it's not a perfect bill. It does not abolish parole, which is what a lot of us would like to do. It does not even just eliminate the concept of technical violations, but it gets us way closer to that than where we are right now. It moves us closer to that ideal of abolition. And so, you know, we hope that that bill might serve as a model for other states who are concerned about this issue and, you know, could take up a similar bill. Maybe you're in a state where you can push it even further than we have in New York, which would be great. Unfortunately, in New York, you know, we're a state that holds itself up as one of the most progressive states in the country, but when you look at our criminal legal system, you really see a different story there. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been very hard to convince lawmakers that people incarcerated for technical violations should not be there. They shouldn't be there ever, but especially not in the midst of a public health crisis. The first two people to die of COVID-19 who contracted it at Rikers Island were there for technical violations of parole. So you have an arrest for something that is not a crime turn into a death sentence for people. And we saw that happen here in New York. We did have a victory where, you know, our campaign was able to pressure Governor Cuomo to order the release of about 800 people being held in local jails in New York on technical violations. But, you know, it just really didn't go far enough. That's only about half of the people who are in our local jails for technical violations on any given day, and it didn't touch the more than 4,000 people who are in our state prisons for those things on any given day. And since that order back at the end of March, you know, parole has continued to arrest people for technical violations, and you know, those gains have been essentially erased by now. So we have a lot of work to do on this issue still. So, you know, I think a lot of times in the abolition space, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, whether we should move forward with incremental reforms. And I think, you know, there are varying opinions about that, but when we look at incremental reforms, like for example, less is more, and if we ask ourselves, you know, is this stripping power from the criminal legal system? Is this stripping power from parole officers? Is this limiting their power? Then absolutely, yes, it is. And it's moving us closer. It's not adding any resources to parole or to prisons. It will ensure that, you know, probably about 7,000 people every year who would be incarcerated are not going to be incarcerated anymore. And so we really think there, you know, are huge gains to be made there, and that they move our abolition project forward. And as I said at the beginning, you know, this also has to be positioned in the conversation around defunding the police. We often forget that probation officers and parole officers are also law enforcement officers, and they operate oftentimes out of sight and without some of the same checks and balances, as few as they are and as poorly enforced as they are against regular police officers. There are sort of even fewer checks and balances on parole and probation officers. And so, you know, we really can't talk about abolition and decarceration, and we can't talk about defunding the police without also talking about defunding parole and abolishing the system of parole. And we hope in New York that we're moving a little closer to that goal, and we hope that others around the country will take up that project as well, and that our Less is More bill might serve as some kind of model for that. I'll close with, I don't have a recording of Derek saying it, but he, at another event, he used this line. He said, when it comes to parole, less is more, but when it comes to reform, more is more. So we'll leave you with that, and thank you so much for having us tonight.
Thank you so much, Ms. Singletary, for that very compelling presentation. Thank you for enlightening us about this Less is More Act. It is our hope, our fervent hope, that it passes and that it does have the impact that we really, truly hope brings relief to thousands. I'm thankful for Brother Singletary's presentation. It is heart-wrenching and a reminder of the inequities in the system. It's actually quite jarring hearing the voice and knowing that this individual, this man, is still behind bars. So thank you so very much for that presentation. It was, you know, when you say the numbers, it's so stark when you talk about, you know, just even 7,500 people being returned to prison on technicalities, not even committing a crime. And the question becomes, what's even the incentive, right? What's the incentive to not commit a crime if you can be hauled in for just a technical violation? I think it's about time then that we bring in our august panel to help us flesh out some of these issues, to talk through their stake on these very important issues. And maybe we can also take a look at solutions. What do we do now? We identify the problem, but what are the possible solutions? And I know Ms. Singletary talked about legislature, but what else can be done? And so it is my distinct honor to introduce to you the panel for today. Brother Jonathan Best is somebody who has been impacted by this very issue. He was arrested for violating parole on a technical issue, not a crime, and he served an extra 93 days. He is on lifetime parole in Massachusetts, lifetime parole. Mr. Best, it is an honor to have you here with us. We thank you that you're able to join us, even if you're sitting in your car, and that's a power of technology that you can still join us from wherever you are. So thank you so very much for being here with us. Next on the panel is probably one of the most respected defense attorneys in the state of Massachusetts. She is an incredible advocate and a defense attorney who supervises the Prisoners' Rights Clinic at Northeastern Law School and teaches students to appear before the parole board. I have such immense respect for Miss Patty Garin, one of our mutual clients, Miss Tina Williams, may her soul rest in peace. Miss Williams was one of our intern social workers at the Criminal Justice Institute here at Harvard Law School, and she was on lifetime parole, and Miss Garin represented her. And every time that I spoke with Tina, Tina was a frequent guest speaker at my class. As one of the classes I teach here at the law school. I teach a class called Mass Incarceration, the impact on parolees and probationers. And Miss Williams was one of the frequent guest speakers. So may she rest in peace. But every time she came, and she came for at least 6 years before she left us, she always mentioned Miss Garin. You were one of her heroes. She talked about you in such glowing terms. So I feel like I owe it to Tina to acknowledge that you are one of the giants of this movement in the state of Massachusetts, and we are honored to have you here on this panel. So join me in welcoming Miss Patty Garin to the panel. Next on the panel is Mr. Wayne Lane. Mr. Lane is also an impacted person who was sent back to prison for 14 months for a technical violation, everyone, a technical violation. Thankfully, he's off parole now. And earlier, you had a little precious baby girl. Is she still there? Because we would like to be able to wave to her, but you had a precious, precious child that just brought us all to smile when you picked her up. So just wonderful to have you on the panel, Mr. Lane, and we look forward to hearing from you. Finally on the panel is Miss Katy Naples-Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell is an attorney working on research and legislation to eliminate the possibility of sending people to prison for parole technical violations. Boy, do we need more people like you, Ms. Naples-Mitchell. Thank you for the awesome work that you do. I call it doing God's work. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And more importantly, thank you for being on this panel, each and every one of you. So what I want to do, I am gonna start with Mr. Lane. I want you to, each panelist will have about 4 minutes to tell us what is your stake in this issue? What are the things that drive you and keep you up at night concerning this issue of technical violations when one is on parole? Feel free to please add anything that I may have missed, but the audience, we want to know, how has this impacted you? What is your role in this process? And then we will take more questions as we come. So Mr. Lane, the floor is yours.
Yes, and thanks for having me, and Emily and Derek, thanks for the opening presentation. That was really beautiful. First of all, my name is Wayne. I'm a proud member of Families for Justice's Healing, an organization dedicated to ending the incarceration of women and girls. EFTA is working to reimagine communities by bringing resources and trauma-informed programming to communities most impacted by policing and imprisonment to address the root cause of incarceration. I just want to pause briefly and salute my sister Andrea James, founder of both National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and EFTA organization, as well as the great leadership of both organizations. I'm also a member of Old Dojo Brothers Healing Circle and New Beginners Reentry Services. So my home is Louisiana, and I was sentenced to a 35-year sentence in Angola, which I served 18 years of that sentence. And believe it or not, most of that sentence was served picking cotton. So, you know, I went through the ringer. I picked cotton up until 2 years from my release date, which I was released in 2002. So not only was that traumatizing, and I thought that after being released, that was all said and done, and I can get on with my life after serving my sentence. Unfortunately, I came to the state of Massachusetts, and I was sentenced, as I said, to a 35-year prison sentence and had to do 17 years on parole. With me doing the 17 years, I had a unfortunate possession of marijuana, not much, and was incarcerated, waiting on Louisiana to come and get me and return me back to Louisiana. Now, prior to when I got out of prison in 2002, 8 months after my release, I went and got my CDL. So not only was I doing great, you know, I was providing for my family and moving in a positive direction. As I said, sitting in jail for the 14 months, not only I lost my job, but also lost my housing as well. So now after being released, I had to start all over again. So during the course of my parole, I think that I spent over $16,000 on parole fees. $16,000 I could have had much better use for. And just the humiliation, you know, I mean, as I said, I worked from the beginning. From the beginning of my release, I worked. And, you know, I can just even remember going to work one particular morning and I was pulled over. And I was pulled over for simply going to work. And after the police officer ran my information and seeing that I was on parole, he eventually let me go before searching my car. He let me on my way. So being that I didn't do anything, I thought it was okay. I didn't report that to my parole officer, which I didn't do it. I was going to work. And I don't know how I kept from being locked up again. But fortunately for me, I was able to get from under that. And but just the humiliation. You know, I had an incident once before that my son lives in the Dorchester area. And I had a parole officer by the name of Andy Champagne. And this man actually told me that I could not go in Dorchester and see my son. And if I went in Dorchester and was caught in Dorchester, and the only reason that he said that I couldn't go to Dorchester because he thought it was a high crime risk. Now, I'm doing everything right. I must report it to the parole office maybe 194 times. And each time that I went into that office, I just knew that I was going back to prison. I mean, that's just how shook up they had me. And still after doing everything right. So, you know, I know reform is definitely needed. And I'm just so happy to be a part of this panel. And I'm just striving to make a difference. And, you know, I definitely appreciate you allowing me to speak and just move forward and try to get something done. Thank you.
Mr. Lane, it is an honor to have you to speak. We are so grateful for sharing your experience. I wish I could see that probation officer right now and have a word with him. I live in Roxbury, okay? I have lived in Roxbury for the past 13 years, so please don't tell me about high crime, because the only place I have ever been become a victim of a crime was in Cambridge. So don't get me started. I am so sorry. Let me pull it back together, Dehlia, pull it back. If I can bring Mr. Best into this conversation. My goodness, you heard Mr. Lane and just the heart-wrenching fear that he lives in. Talked about traumatized and how $16,000 that could be used for his children, that could be used towards a house or a car or savings, retirement, is being used towards bogus parole fees. Mr. Best, what was your experience like, and what's your stake in this conversation?
My experience is extremely similar to the last person that just spoke. Sorry, I'm a little under the weather, so forgive me a little bit. This parole has me walking on eggshells, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Whenever I hear a police car, I pull over quickly. Even when I'm laying down on my bed, if I hear a police car, I'm looking out the window, seeing if they're pulling up to me for a violation. Excuse me, because this gets me emotional. Because I still feel incarcerated. The littlest thing that happens, I feel like I'm going back. I'm seeing parole at my house twice a week. Twice a month. Not once a month, but twice a month. One for the breathalyzer and 2 for urine for drugs. You know, when they come in your house, they even violate your house because sometimes you want to look around and just being nosy at what they can see. It violates my mother, it violates my brother, whoever's in the house. You know, they have to go in the room while my parole officer stands there and watch me pee. The $80 or whatever we have to pay a month, it definitely needs to be looked into. Because if you miss that more than once or twice, you're threatened with incarceration. Right away, they don't hesitate. You're threatened to go back. Like you said, if you're not working in a suitable amount of time for them, and jobs are hard. Jobs are hard, especially now. You will go back. Just the threat, just to let them know, just them telling you, makes sometimes I have suicidal thoughts, so I don't have to go back. You know, it's really, really mind-boggling, and really like being like, if you're not on time, and I'm hoping like a lot of times when I'm not on time that I don't get pulled over, because you get pulled over, they run your name and go straight to the parole office. You know, that you got pulled over. Then you have to explain to them, come up with a good story why you was out past curfew. And if whatever mood that they're in, you better hope that they're in a decent mood, that they don't violate you right there. And then on top of that, if you're late, they want to urine and take a breathalyzer. They want you to come in just for that alone, just for being late, just to make sure you're not high or drunk or out getting high or whatever the case may be. I can't count how many times I've been to the office just because I worked and still work with ex-felons. I'm not even able to walk down the street or even visit my wife, my ex-wife now, but we're still good friends because she's an ex-felon. You know, this whole thing has me. And listen, I could tell you about post-traumatic stress, but I am way beyond that. Way beyond that. Sometimes I don't want to take it and scare anybody, but it just kills me to have to go through this and still be, sometimes I'd rather be incarcerated, and to feel that way and I'm free is definitely shouldn't be happening. I'm free. I'm a free man. I'm out here in the world, and I shouldn't feel like that any second now that all that is going to be taken away. And to think that all of my family, when they was crying and everything at the parole board, and to have to go through all that all over again, it's mind-boggling. I can't do it to my family. I can't do it anymore. You know, I can't do it. Sometimes I just want to give up. I'm gonna tell you the truth. Sometimes I just want to give up. I really do. Sometimes I just want to give up. But I hang in there because I only got one daughter who I love dearly, and my 2 grandchildren. But I mean, this country's where you commit a murder on whoever it may be, and you do 20, 30 years, and you're all done with that. But to be out here on this, man, is not conducive to a person's well-being at all, mental state or anything. I spent a lot of time in the hole and everything. Like, listen, I'm no angel, but I'm not a perfect human being by any. I'm fallible by like everybody else, but I don't deserve this. My family loves and cares about me daily, And everybody knows that wasn't me that committed crimes. They seem the real me now, the authentic me now. But little do they know I'm dying inside. I'm dying inside. You know, but, you know, I don't want to take up too much time, but I can go on and on and on. You know, but I love to talk and express myself now. I'm just a little too emotional after hearing my last friend talk, what he went through, picking cotton. Where were we at? Where are we at, man? I really, like, come on, where are we at? But with that, I just got to gather myself. I apologize, you know, but.
Mr. Best, please don't apologize. There's nothing to apologize for. So just, sorry, I'm supposed to be having it all together here, but so please forgive me. But okay. Just, I want to thank you for trusting us enough to share your emotion and your experience with us. We honor you for doing that. I would like to tell you that there are tons of people who are sending in encouragement through the chat. I'm pretty sure you can't see it, but there are tons of people who are saying, please hang in there. Please don't give up. Your voice is an important one. Your voice is a critical one. Your voice is necessary. If we don't have you telling the story, we are not going to know any better, and the system is not going to change. We need your voice loud and clear in this process, because it's the only way if the needle is to move, it's the only way it's going to move if we continue to hear what you're saying. I'm telling you, this idea of picking cotton shook me. And so, because we're not describing 1960s, or, you know, we're describing 2000. My child was born 2002, Mr. Lane, the year you came out, and to think that this is still the story of America needs to make us all determined to do our part. So we honor you, Mr. Best, and thank you for sharing your story. And now I want to bring Katy into the conversation, and I'm so sorry. I am looking at you, Katy, and I know that you probably feel the same way I am feeling right now, and it's that same passion that leads to empathy and compassion and lights a fire under us to continue to do the work we do and represent this marginalized demographic that we do. Tell us about your work, about who you are, and how you view, what's the prism, the lens through which you view these issues.
Thank you so much, Dehlia, and really thank you, Jonathan and Wayne, for those testimonials. I mean, I think it's very clear after you all have spoken that, as Andrea James has said in the chat, you know, these are the modern relics of slavery continuing, right? And I think to Emily's point about bringing this into an abolitionist framework, what we see on parole and probation is how policing exists in so many different forms, right? Beyond the police department, policing is what is happening on probation and parole, and we see it in the little kind of social control in terms of the conditions themselves that are put on people, and then how they are enforced, right? The fact that it can be an extremely common condition of both parole and probation to abstain from consuming alcohol for people who have no history of alcohol substance use disorder, right? That is just about social control. It is just about managing people's lives and continuing to punish people. And it's a system of criminal punishment. We don't refer to it as a criminal justice system at the Houston Institute. So who I am, my name is Katy Naples-Mitchell. I'm a legal fellow at the Houston Institute here at Harvard Law School. I've been here for about 2 years, and I do mostly work to try to amplify the demands of community-based organizations with lived experience who we view as the experts, and who have for too long been excluded from policymaking conversations. So I see a lot of folks in the chat who we work really closely with, Stacey Borden and Andrea James. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight, from Families for Justice as Healing and the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. Part of the project that we're undertaking is to look at parole from kind of a systems perspective, looking not only at this issue of technical revocations, which is a huge problem in Massachusetts, and I want to kind of shed some more light on the statistics that Emily already introduced for us, but to think about whether people even go for their parole hearings in the first place, right? Part of the fear of the continuation of incarceration within the community, the way that cages are creeping into our homes and communities because of community supervision, as it's called, parole and probation, is that people don't want that experience of feeling caged in their own home and in their own lives and communities, and so they waive their parole hearings to begin with. So in 2018, the parole board, issues an annual report on its statistics, and almost 2,500 people who are incarcerated just waived their hearing to go before the board, preferring instead to remain incarcerated in jail or state prison, rather than have to be under the punitive conditions of control that might land them back in jail or prison, back to a cage. This is one of the ways that that the numbers kind of belie some of the truth in Massachusetts, because our parole board reports out, high rates of parole. 71% of people who went before the board were paroled, and you saw those relative to New York, smaller numbers in terms of the number of people returned to prison on a technical revocation. But if you dig a kind of a line deeper to see the part of the scope of the problem is that people don't even want to subject themselves to these conditions because of how dehumanizing they are. How much of this is really a system of terrorism of Black and brown people, right? Of instilling that fear of being returned to prison. So in terms of the numbers, Emily gave the statistics comparing Massachusetts and New York, and it is true that in the national landscape, Massachusetts has a lower incarceration rate than every other state in the country, but we still spend far too much on incarceration. In fact, so much funding goes towards prisons and jails in Massachusetts. The budgets increase every year for our Department of Corrections and our sheriffs, even though we incarcerate fewer and fewer people. All of that money is going towards staffing costs, going towards the social control of people on probation and parole. And the scope of the kind of net widening of probation and parole, right? We know that 2.3 million people are incarcerated in this country, but 6.4 million are under some form of supervision, including incarceration. So we see that looking out to the scale in this conversation is so important because of how much broader that scope is. Massachusetts has an extremely high rate of incarceration on life without parole sentences. We are among the top 5 states in the country. 1 in every 4 people in Massachusetts prisons in 2016 was serving a life or virtual life sentence. And that number comes from statistics collected by the Sentencing Project, which we're glad to see some folks from the Sentencing Project here tonight as well. So with that in mind, one of the other policy changes that is kind of a part of this conversation is thinking about granting people access to parole to begin with. Many people who are sentenced to sentence of death by incarceration in Massachusetts don't ever get to see the parole board and have the opportunity to be released into the community. So some of the legislation that's been introduced recently was to try to address that particular part of the problem, try to grant more people access to parole in the first place. But there has been no movement on the legislative front to try to address this problem of people being returned to prison because of supposed breach of a condition of release, whether it's missing a curfew or talking to somebody who has a criminal record themselves, or any other number of having a kind of relapse on a substance use disorder, which is a health condition, right? Should not be criminalized to begin with, let alone land somebody back in prison after they're out on parole. So all of these issues kind of blend together to create a patchwork network of total discretion in parole officers who may have really no interest in helping people stabilize once they leave incarceration, and instead end up just monitoring people's behavior in an effort to return them to incarceration, right? That's what we see in the numbers. The statistics for our return rate on technical parole revocation, Jean Traunstein, who's joining us, who's a journalist who's written about this for Dig Boston and the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, among other outlets, has done a number of records requests to show how many people are returned to prison exclusively for technical revocations from parole. And 87% across 4 years were just for technical revocations. And even during COVID, right, when we know that it's among the least safe places that a person could be right now during this pandemic is inside a jail or prison, because of the congregate settings, because it's impossible to socially distance in a prison, because of the existing inadequacies in healthcare delivery, you name it. Every kind of perfect storm element exists in a prison. So even during COVID, 78% of people returned to prison from parole, it was for a technical violation. I think the conversation around technical violations, also I want to say from an abolitionist perspective, we don't want to kind of privilege that over the fact that people are also returned to prison for what is colloquially referred to as committing a new crime, but is really just a new arrest, right? And we have a presumption of innocence in this country and in Massachusetts, where a new arrest does not mean a new conviction or that somebody committed a crime. What it more often means is that somebody has a criminal record and is being tailed by the police, and the police find some excuse to pull them over for a motor vehicle violation or something of that nature, and there you are wrapped up in the system again. So I want to note for our panel that while we're talking specifically about technical revocations today, we also have to talk about the broader issue of kind of the mission creep of incarceration into our communities, including for new arrests, which again, somebody might be acquitted on that charge, or the charge may be dismissed, or a prosecutor may issue a nolle prosequi, but they might still end up back in prison on that new arrest. Where it's functionally working very similar to a technical revocation. So in terms of specific policy changes in Massachusetts, we are looking absolutely at the Less is More Act as a template for how we might move forward. And I think some of the most important provisions in that bill are, of course, the restrictions on sending people back, but also the 30 for 30 that Derek talked about, right, of giving people access to early termination of their parole when they don't have an alleged violation. And in general, we think that that's imperative, right, to be shrinking the system and incentivizing people to opt for having a parole hearing in order to get more people out of incarceration, right? The 2,500 people who waived their hearings in 2018 might instead have been released and might never have gone back if some kind of provisions like Less is More in New York were implemented. And Massachusetts has been glaringly absent from reform around parole over the last 10 years, but in particular over the last 5 years, where in 2018, the state has prided itself on passing what it considers a landmark, quote, criminal justice reform, end quote, bill, where parole remained largely untouched. And there is currently a bill pending to do kind of a really minor version of Less is More New York with respect to probation that would eliminate the possibility of reincarceration for a violation of a drug and alcohol prohibition if the person has a substance use disorder and so it was a relapse pursuant to a health condition, which is a tiny piece of that of kind of the proposal of Less is More New York. But even that bill has not been able to move in our legislature, which despite being a so-called progressive state, ends up having a really conservative bent. So one of the things that we're trying to figure out over here is how to strategically frame legislation. And so our work ends up not being often original data and research. We have colleagues here at the law school, like the Criminal Justice Policy Program, who just released an excellent review of kind of 4-year report on racial disparities in the criminal legal system here in Massachusetts, which is a searching report and also in many ways told us information we already know, just with more kind of proof and confidence. And so part of our work at the Houston Institute is to try to collect all of the information from elsewhere and repackage it and say, this is information we already know. The experts we need need to listen to are people like Jonathan Best and Wayne Lane and Stacey Borden and Andrea James and so many others who have that direct experience, and then we can kind of bring the existing data to back it. So that's where we are in the process. It's going to continue as we move forward with this research, trying to talk to more people who've had experiences on parole and try and pass or develop as much of an abolitionist campaign around technical parole revocation as we can.
Oh, thank you so very much, Katy. That was so informative and very helpful. We thank you for all the many people who out here in the chat lauding you on and letting you, you know, a lot of people are not only impressed by your work, but are supporting you and gathering to let you know, keep doing the amazing, great work that you're doing. This might be a good time to let you know that if you would like your question answered, please type it in the Q&A section. Please don't put it in the chat, but it is too busy in the chat for me to look at the questions. So if you put it in the Q&A section, chances are that we will get to your question, but please put it in the proper section, the Q&A section, and not in the chat, because the chat, like I said, is a little too busy for me to keep track. And so now we will hear from the legendary Patty Garin, whose life and legacy has been about working really hard for the individuals impacted by parole and our incarceration system. Ms. Garin?
Thanks, Dehlia, and everybody else who spoke. I find it incredibly moving. And I want everyone who's listening to know that what John unusual. What they're telling you is reflective of what everybody experiences when they're out on parole to some degree or another. Every single person goes through these emotions, goes through this fear, goes through this being scared to go anywhere, to believing they can be picked up at any minute for doing virtually nothing. So when you listen to what they say, know that that's what all of these people who are out on parole are experiencing every day. Now, Massachusetts doesn't have the population that New York has, but when you think about even the small population in Massachusetts, that we send over 400 people back to prison a year on just technical violations. 400 over, well over. That 400 number came up during the last 6 months of COVID time when they're supposed to be doing a more careful job about sending people back. And still there's 400 people a year. So those people are going back for the most minor things. And I just want to read you, in Massachusetts, you have 8 standard parole conditions, and every single parolee has the same 8. And then you get special conditions added on after that. But let me just tell you what 2 of the conditions are that go with every single person on parole in this state. I will conduct myself in the manner of a responsible citizen. How about that? What do you think that leads to? Who do you think decides who's a responsible citizen? Your parole officer. That's who decides. And what is being a responsible citizen? Oh, don't miss a meeting. Don't come late. Don't miss your curfew. Don't have a drink if you've never had an alcohol problem in your entire life. All of the things that we all do as citizens every day add up to being not responsible if you're a parolee. And it leads to, I have never represented someone on a parole violation where they didn't have at least 3 or 4 charges of being an irresponsible citizen tacked onto it. The other one that everybody has to deal with is, I will not associate with persons I know who have a criminal record. Criminal record means they've been arrested. They don't have to have committed a felony. I mean, anybody, they call it a criminal record. And that is a race-based condition. It affects people of color completely. They cannot associate with friends. The people who can provide the most support and the most that they need when they're getting out of prison are sometimes the people who are in this category. Because people of color are arrested more often than other people, they are prevented from seeing the people they love, the people they need to see, the people that they want to work with and go to school with and live with They can't see them, and if they do, they pick up a violation. Those are just 2 of these 8 conditions. And I can tell you, they work to incarcerate people needlessly. Needlessly. People are incarcerated based on their color, they're based on their wealth, based on their cultural background, but they are not incarcerated based on serious misconduct. Occasionally, yes, but mostly no. That's not what's going on here. The other thing I want you to talk about before we go to the whole panel discussion is, as people have mentioned, we have a lot of people in Massachusetts who are on life sentences, almost more than every other state. So we have a lot of people who are out on parole for the rest of their lives in Massachusetts, because you get a life sentence with parole eligibility, you're on parole forever. And so there's a statute in Massachusetts that allows you to move to terminate parole. When it's in the public interest, the statute says you can move and ask the parole board to terminate your parole. And we have filed petitions on behalf of parolees who've been on parole for 15, 20, 30, 35 years with perfect conduct, not a thing wrong. And we filed those petitions, and the petitions come back with parolee doing nothing more than what the board expects, denied. And just as one final thing, to get you to see how bad the parole board really functions and how much we need a cultural change at the board. We need people on the parole board who actually believe in people getting out and doing well. We need a cultural change. Our parole board is full of law enforcement people by and large, and we have 2 people who aren't from law enforcement on our board, and it reflects in the way they act. When I filed a petition to terminate parole for the woman that Dehlia brought up, Tina Williams, she'd been out for over 20 years. She'd earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in social work. She had worked at nonprofits helping homeless women and women with substance use issues for 12 and 15 years at this point when I filed petitions to terminate her parole. She was the guardian of a granddaughter and a daughter. She was such a responsible citizen, but she was still on parole, living under the fear that Jonathan and Wayne told you about every day of her life. I filed 3 petitions in her lifetime to terminate her parole. They were all denied. The last one was filed 3 years before her death. I told the parole board she was dying of cancer, and the last wish she had was to be off of parole before she died. And the parole board sat on it for 3 years and never ruled on it. And she died on parole, to her sadness. And that is sort of a reflection of what our parole board is like, that story. Thank you.
Goodness, my goodness, my goodness, my Lord. Ooh, thank you, Ms. Garin. Okay, so we are going to take some questions. We are definitely going to take some questions. Thank you so very much for crystallizing that just pulling it all together. That was very well done. Thank you, Ms. Garin. One of the questions that we are going to take, and let's get right into it. If I can pull this up. So sorry, a few things open here. All right, so and let me start with you, Ms. Garin, because I think this might be a question from Kimberly Dyke Halsey, and she asked, if technical violations occur due to breach of contract or parole, probation, plea violation, shouldn't a contract attorney be involved at the beginning versus a criminal defense attorney? Anyway, so that's a question that she had.
Okay, well, the reason I am involved in parole revocation issues is because I work with students and I take on clients on my own. In Massachusetts, unlike New York, you don't have any right to legal representation at a revocation hearing. So not only are you abused when you're arrested and brought back to prison, but you're not afforded a lawyer in Massachusetts at a parole revocation hearing. You are for probation revocation, but not for parole. So we have all of these people serving life sentences coming back to prison who don't let alone a contract attorney. They don't even get a criminal defense attorney to represent them. Which is, we argue that it's a violation of a Supreme Court case, and some states have decided to appoint people to represent people, but not in Massachusetts. That doesn't happen. And I'm not sure a contract attorney is, I think it's a creative idea, and I think we'll think about that, but the wording of these parole conditions is so general that who's to say you violated the contract if what you sign or what your contract is you'll be a responsible citizen? I mean, that's kind of a matter of dispute, and you know what your parole officer is going to say. So again, we need a change in the culture of the people who are running parole is what we really need.
Thank you, Ms. Garin. This question is from Alan Hutchinson Maxwell, and he's asking, and this, Katy, I'm going to direct this question to you. What can we do? What can we do to advocate for reform abolition in Massachusetts? Is there a bill we can pressure legislators on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, like I mentioned, there are some bills that are trying to kind of piecemeal attack the parole system. And so to Patty's great point about the makeup of the parole board, there is currently a bill pending that our colleagues at Prisoners Legal Services have been especially stewarding through the legislative process as advocates to try to change the makeup of the board, to expand the number of people on the board, and to require that some of them have a background in social work or substance use disorder or a mental health training, a different specialty that would look at the process and the goal of parole differently. But the kind of change that we're looking for, that this panel is really targeting, there isn't currently a bill pending to try to redress the problem of technical revocations. And so that's part of what our research is geared toward, is to try and develop by November language that we could get legislators to introduce in the upcoming legislative session, in part modeled on Less is More New York, but also with more specific goals for Massachusetts geared toward our system. And part of that is thinking through with directly impacted people, right, to what is the biggest change you want. And so I'm just going to put in a plug for some other abolitionist work that's ongoing right now in Massachusetts, especially with so many leaders from Families for Justice Healing and the National Council in the room, that there is a bill we're pushing very heavily right now. More than 100 organizations have signed on to support the bill for no-cost calls in prisons and jails in Massachusetts. And if you are not already plugged in, you can go to tinyurl.com/MA Week of Action and start contacting your legislators to help us move that bill. It is still alive. It is sitting in the Senate waiting for a floor vote. And we, that demand for stopping the exploitation of people who are incarcerated and their loved ones certainly fits into the broader picture motivating this event. So I hope you'll join in that action.
Thank you, Katy. Ms. Singletary, there's a question about New York. So I will pose this to you. It says, can you speak about what New York State does to sex offenders when released on parole? If they have no safe place where they are sent, where they can go, they are sent to an RTF. An RTF is a prison, and this person goes on to say that their son is in prison on a technical violation and will be sent to one of these. Could you just briefly speak to that?
Sure. I don't have specific expertise in that issue, but it's absolutely true that in New York, and I am willing to wager that this is true across the country, that there is a whole slew of additional parole conditions for people convicted of sex offenses. So they don't just have the standard list like what Patty read earlier, but there are a bunch of additional restrictions as well that might include restrictions on where they can live. It includes restrictions on whether they can have a smartphone. They can use a telephone, but they can't have access to the internet. And so that, of course, in the year 2020 presents all kinds of challenges for people, and people can go back to prison for having a phone. So there are all these added restrictions, and yes, I mean, we have a housing crisis for people convicted of sex offenses. We also have, a crisis in terms of those folks needing mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment. Residential facilities, treatment facilities will not take people convicted of sex offenses often. And so they're left without services, they're left without housing, and they do often end up reincarcerated indefinitely because of that, because parole cannot find a place to release them to that will take them. And it's also, like I said, a much lower threshold for them to be violated for a parole violation. Additionally, in New York, parole conducts polygraph tests on people on parole convicted of sex offenses. They do not do that for any other people on parole in New York, only for people convicted of sex offenses. And so randomly, your parole officer will conduct a polygraph test, asking you if you've accessed the internet, if you might have watched a movie with certain scenes in it, if you've had contact with certain people, and depending on the results of that polygraph test, you may be violated and reincarcerated. So it's a really important issue to bring up. You know, we've made people convicted of sex offenses into pariahs in our country, with no scientific evidence to justify that. People convicted of sex offenses actually have one of the lowest recidivism rates if you look at the data. And, you know, so it's a huge problem in the entire system, not just parole, and across our country. And I thank you for raising that, and my heart goes out to you and your son dealing with that situation.
Thank you for answering that question. So just a reminder that if you would like your question answered by this remarkable panel, please make sure that you do so through the Q&A. I am unable to sort the questions out through the chat because they're coming in fast and furious. And so if you have a question, please put that in the Q&A. Mr. Best and Mr. Lane, both of you, there is a question from Lauren Gibbs, and I'm going to try to paraphrase her question, mostly because I want to steer it into this other question. She says, there needs to be a campaign to tell people what the Governor's Council does. Why do we need a Governor's Council who put better people on the parole board than Governor Baker's people? The question I want to parlay that into is, if you were to, what would you like to see as characteristics of a person who is a parole officer? What would you like to see? What kind of characteristics should they have? What sort of qualifications should they have? Should there be a standard for parole officers, and not just individuals who are exercising power on a whim? And that question is for both of you, Mr. Lane and Mr. Best.
Yeah, you go on. You got it, Jonathan? You on mute.
You are muted, Mr. Best.
Okay. First of all, they all should take aptitude tests, as far as I'm concerned, and find out where their heads at, where they've been, where they grew up, how they grew up, so forth and so on. Same as police officers should take it as well. And the Governor's Council, to me, is a joke. I wish I could laugh, but I'm not that hilarious right now. As far as I'm concerned, they're yes people. The governor controls them, tells them how to think, what to think, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm dealing with a little bit of facts because I'm in with a few different people that are around them type of people. But the Governor's Council, as far as I'm concerned, is a joke. I forgot the young lady's name. Just putting those petitions in for people that have not made any type of violations and so forth and so on, and still get shot down. What was the purpose of having those laws in place if we're not even going to use them? Like, this absolutely is, it's a moot. Like, it makes no sense to me at all. Like, I'll let you go finish before I get upset.
Yeah, I just want to kind of add to Jonathan. First of all, I think it need to be more people like us sitting on those boards that, like I said, I completed 17 years of parole. So I was able to navigate that system. And I just want to quickly give a shout out to Jonathan because, we just go back to what I said earlier. I picked cotton for 10 years of the 18 years I was incarcerated. And I can relate to what Jonathan said about going back because I've been harassed. I was harassed so much while on parole. See, if it don't be for my family, I could see myself going back in that same situation, picking cotton again, believe it or not. So, I just wanted to give a pull up to Jonathan, keep your head held high, brother. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm very proud of you, and you're going to get through this here.
Thank you. You too.
All right, so more questions coming in. And this one is, I'm just gonna put this out to whomever can answer it. Actually, before I do that, there's Dean Williams, who is the executive director for the Colorado Department of Corrections, who's on here all the way from Colorado. It's nice to see people. I'm hoping, sir, that this has been helpful to you and that you can take the information being relayed here and help the people out in Colorado. It's just really nice to see all sorts of people coming up here. I also want to give a shout out to Andrea James. That woman is is amazing, and I've had the privilege of moderating a panel that she was on, and I have to tell you, that sister is fantastic. So it's just such a blessing to see you on here, Sister James. And so to the question says, does anyone know if the conditions behind the corruption charges against the parole board in 2020 remains at issue today? That's from Bridget Conley. I'm not sure whether Katy or Ms. Garin, you might have some information on that.
I'm not exactly sure what the corruption, I mean, I can think of some, but I'm not exactly sure which corruption allegation she's thinking of. That would be helpful if we knew that. I think there's a lot of issues about our parole board not doing their job properly that have been in the newspaper a lot lately, that they haven't, when a lifer goes before a parole board, it takes our parole board 8 to 10 months, sometimes a year, to write a decision. Why? Why does it take them 12 months to write a decision in a case? They don't rule on commutation petitions. There was a Globe editorial about that. They're way behind in that. They don't rule on petitions to terminate parole. Why don't they do that? I mean, there's a lot of, those aren't really, that's not really corruption. That's just the facts. Those are just the facts we've gotten from public records requests of things that are wrong. But if there's corruption allegations, I'd love to hear them.
I accidentally muted myself there. So let me actually follow up then with this question. Is it true, Lisa Berland wants to know, is it true that many incarcerated people in Massachusetts prefer to complete a sentence rather than go on parole? And this is to all of you, because as part of my duties, I represent a lot of indigent folks, and I have had clients say to me, I'd rather just do my sentence, be done with it, and not have to answer to anyone. I've had clients tell me that all the time. Do you find that that is a similar sentiment? Mr. Best, Mr. Lane, Katy, Ms. Garin, please feel free to jump in on this question.
Yes, I think especially with guys that have a short sentence.
Yes.
That's 4 or 5 years from coming home. Yeah, I think it's they feel it's in their best interest to not accept parole, and it's just it's almost impossible to do parole. I don't know. I just count my blessings now. I don't know how I did 17 years on parole. So yes, I think it's in most people's best interest to do their shorter sentence without coming out on parole.
Mr. Best?
And what type of mind frame does that tell you all? When a person says he would rather be away from his family in a cage, poked like a damn animal for the next 4 years instead of coming out with his freedom. What does that tell you about parole? Like, a person, you have to have a mental deficiency to not want to come out on parole. And if I could have stayed 20 years and did 20 years or 25 years without being on parole, I would have done it. I would have done it too. But what does that tell you about being on parole? Just that alone. And then coming out into society and they don't prepare you for it either? No, something is wrong there. The parole system is broken.
And another point about people not showing up for parole hearings, at least in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we have a lot of people who are doing shorter sentences in houses of correction. And so they have a parole hearing that, you know, might be a few months or 6 months into the future. And for those folks, a lot of them, they go for a parole hearing, they get a positive vote for parole, and our parole board still takes another 2 months to get them out of prison on parole, even though they've gotten a positive vote. The board has to go and approve their home placement and mess with their conditions, and it just is endless. And so a lot of those, and when Emily said when Katy said there's a statistic about how many people get out on parole, that statistic is really the percentage of positive votes, because a lot of those positive votes never get out on parole. And the parole board reports positive votes for parole, not people who actually get out of prison, because so many people get a positive vote and never get out, either because they're close and they don't want to mess with parole, or because it just takes parole so long to get them out that they just say, forget it. And that's a big problem. And, you know, Wayne and Jonathan are right. People with short sentences feel like, why should I go through the humiliation? I can't stomach going through the humiliation of being on parole. I'll just finish my time in prison.
That's absolutely right. I just wanted to add on to that in fact, the latest data we have, which I think comes from a Boston Bar Association report, or maybe a Council of State Governments Justice Center report, actually from a few years ago, 2015, said that the average wait between your positive parole vote and your parole permit when you actually get out on parole is 200 days. So that people can spend, you know, 2/3 of a year when they're legally allowed to be out of the prison or the jail, still waiting to actually go home.
So Katy, if I can actually ask you a follow-up question, or not a different question. So Madeline DeMules wants to know, when a parole board makes a decision, are there possibilities of court review of that decision as it is seen on an executive agency, as an executive agency within the state? If so, how do courts usually react to these requests for review?
So Patty may be better equipped to answer that question than I am, but my understanding is generally no, that there isn't really judicial review of the decision to grant or deny parole. That is exclusively within the province of the parole board. Now, there could be broader systems issues where the parole board might be implicated, where you can challenge, make a challenge, but in general, the grant of parole or the denial of parole itself, no, is not subject to judicial review. And the parole board has it within their discretion to, especially for lifer hearings, to extend the setback of when you next get to see the board. So the board can sort of arbitrarily say, you can come back in 2 years, or you can come back in 5 years, or, you know, they have so much discretion and authority to control people's lives, and spend so much of the time in parole hearings just recapitulating the facts of the offense that was the underlying offense of conviction, right? Not actually looking at the person before them and who they are and how they have grown and changed and how their family and community is welcoming them home, but instead focusing so much on the crime of conviction. And that's why in part people are really focused on trying to shift the makeup of the board and the expertise of people on the board.
I would just add that there is a judicial review. It's in a narrow kind of circumstance. If the board denies you parole, you are allowed to sue the parole board in what's called a cert petition, and you can allege that the parole board made a legal mistake, did something wrong. The problem with that is that the review is usually abuse of discretion, and deciding whether somebody's fit for parole is something that most judges don't want to touch. So you do technically have an opportunity to bring a cert petition under a specific statute and challenge what the board did. They're not usually successful, but I will say that in the last year or so, because our public defender office has been appointing more people to represent people because of the COVID crisis and before that, when parole was getting out of control, the more lawyers step in and get an eyeful of what's going on, they're just horrified. They just cannot believe it. And there's more and more lawsuits challenging the parole board all the time, but it's still not nearly enough. I mean, the change is creeping incrementally. It's not what we need. We need some bigger change than just suing them every time they deny somebody parole, but there are lawsuits going on now.
Thank you so very much for answering that question, Ms. Garin. So just a reminder that this session is being recorded. It will be posted on the Charles Hamilton Houston website. We want to apologize to the Facebook folks, because those on Facebook, because we weren't able to get a live stream going. Again, it will be, this recording will be posted to the Institute's Facebook page. In the meantime, I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then I want to give our panelists an opportunity to just tell us their parting thoughts. So the question I wanted to ask is one posted by Cindy Prezio, and Cindy is from One Standard of Justice in Connecticut, and she wanted to know whether there are exclusions based on type of offense or are all included. I'm assuming that she's saying, are there any exclusions that will violate parole, or is everything sort of up for grabs? And anyone can jump in on that.
I think when that question came in, it actually might have been in reference to the legislation in New York, that it was about whether there are any exclusions for that legislation. So Emily might want to take that.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarification. As always, it takes a village.
Yeah, no problem.
Emily.
Sure. So there is one exclusion in the bill that, is not something that any of us who drafted the bill are comfortable with, but was something that we needed to put in there in order for it to be viable in the legislature, unfortunately. And that is that the what we refer to as the 30 for 30, where you can earn early discharge from parole for every 30 days you go without violating. You earn 30 days off your time on parole. That provision does not apply, unfortunately, to people who are on life parole. There is a merit-based mechanism that already exists in New York for people on life parole to apply for early discharge after successfully completing 3 years on parole. It's not automatic and it's not granted as often as it should be, but there is that merit-based mechanism there. Our goal, as part of the Less is More New York Coalition, is to get less is more through the legislature, and then continue working on these issues, including the issues specific to people on life parole. We have a lot of people on life parole who are members of our various organizations, and one of the organizations in the coalition, A Little Piece of Light, is led by Donna Hilton, who served 27 years in prison and came out on life parole. She did earn that merit-based discharge, thankfully, although it took her, I believe, 5 years rather than 3 in order for them to grant it. And so, we do have a broad base of people on life parole who support Less is More New York regardless of that exclusion because they recognize that the rest of the bill does apply to them. So, you know, the due process protections, the restrictions on incarceration, not going back to jail for technical violations, everyone is included in that stuff, including people on life parole. So, you know, as I said during the keynote, it's not a perfect bill. We're dealing with political realities that we have to contend with, unfortunately. But that does not mean that, you know, less is more New York is the be all end all of parole reform in New York. We have lots more to do after we get that bill passed. You're muted, Dehlia.
Always. Unmute yourself is the first lesson you learn on Zoom. Unmute thyself, woman. All right, so I'm going to ask one last question, which is really directed to Ms. Garin, which is, somebody wants to know, in this era of COVID-19, how long it would take someone to be released on parole in Massachusetts?
If they have a positive parole vote and a release date, I think that during the COVID crisis, that has been much faster. I would say that I can't give an exact amount of time for anyone, but I would say that our parole board has, in conjunction with the Public Defender Office, Committee for Public Counsel Services, Committee for Public Counsel Services has been assigning an attorney to everybody who needs help finding a home plan, which has changed everything. And during non-COVID times, that help isn't there. But since COVID, Committee for Public Counsel Services has been assigning an attorney to everybody who needs a home plan, everybody who has a release date, and it's been moving much more quickly. And it's a good lesson to learn about how much an advocate can help, because it doesn't work on its own. You need those advocates out there pushing it.
Thank you for answering that question. That question was from Ms. Herland. All right, so we have come to that section of our program today where I'm done with the questions. I apologize profusely from the bottom of my heart if I didn't get to your question. We don't have enough time to be able to do that, but thank you so very much for doing so. I would like to spend the rest of our time together, given some time for each of our panelists to leave us with a parting thought about whatever it is that's on their mind. And before we actually do that, I really want to extend my sincerest thanks and appreciation to Ms. Trounstein Jean. You are remarkable. Thank you for the amazing work that you have done pulling this panel together, pulling this event together. You are wonderful. Thank you so much. And to Dave Harris, who is the Managing Director of the Charles Hamilton Institute here at Harvard Law School. Buddy, thank you very much for doing great work. You are so much appreciated. I'm hopeful that this is just the first of many conversations that we have around these issues, but this has been wonderful and great. And I want to start off the closing remarks by going to Mr. Lane first.
First of all, thanks so very much for having me. I just appreciate this much needed conversation. And, you know, I really feel blessed this day and time that I was able to do this past 35 years and to have my sanity intact. So after what I endured, I'm just counting my blessings. And, you know, once again, I just want to thank you all for having me, and let's keep doing this positive work and keep moving forward, and let's make a change. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Lane. I think your story, for me, was a pleasure meeting you. Your story will stay with me for a very, very long time. Mr. Best. You were muted. You're still muted, Mr. Best. There you go.
Yeah. All right. I want to say I appreciate everybody as well, and it's oh man, it's a tremendous feeling when you know that there are people out there that care. it just brightens the light on a lot of things, and my heart and my emotions to know that there are actually people who want to help and not turn your back on you because you're a fallible human being. So I definitely appreciate everybody and everything that happened today. I know it wasn't easy, but in dealing with me, I want to say I apologize because it's very, I don't want to go there. But anyway, I appreciate everybody and I love everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Best. You will never know how impactful what you shared with us is. This is why we do this. This is exactly why we do this, so that we will never forget. We will never forget. So thank you so very much. Katy. Oh, there's that precious child I was talking about. There she is. There you are. Katy.
So distracted by, Wayne and that beautiful baby. Gosh, I just got to say thank you all so much. And, one thing that I've been sitting with today, there was a big decision that came down from our state Supreme Judicial Court today about pretextual stops, which is a big win, and about racism in policing. And so I'm carrying some of the language from the concurrence by our one Black female judge, Kimberly Budd, on the court, who wrote, using new data to confirm the existence of an already undeniable systemic problem is not the same as changing the system of rules and practices that perpetuate racial discrimination in policing. And I just want to carry that on in this panel as well, that so often we hear the legislature calling for more data, and that becomes the win and the rallying cry. But what we actually need is systems change. And what that means is curbing the power and scope of policing in all its forms, including in parole, and especially with technical revocations of parole, and empowering and building the resources of directly impacted Black and Brown communities that have been subject to systematic racial discrimination for centuries. So that is my parting word. We're going to try and carry that work on, and would be grateful for you all to join us. Thank you.
And we will join you, Katy. Thank you so very much. Sister Emily.
This has just been such an honor, and I know I speak for Derek when I say that too. I've learned so much from all of you on the panel. I especially want to lift up Wayne and Jonathan, because I know it's not easy to talk about, what you've been through, and I appreciate you trusting all of us with that and sharing your expertise. And then, even though my husband can't hear me, I want to shout him out, because how many people from prison are writing legislation and giving keynotes at Harvard Law School? And we need more of that. So, I just would encourage everyone to, to find the Waynes and the Jonathans and the Dereks wherever you are, and follow their lead.
Thank you so very much. We applaud you. That was remarkable to be able to hear your husband's voice. And I also just want to thank you for doing what you're doing, standing by him and being amazing through this process. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Ms. Garin.
Boy, I don't know what to say to top those closings, except to thank all of you for being here and talking about this. I found it very moving and very persuasive. And I think everybody here should be turning to their legislators and advocating in groups. And everybody here is already involved in groups. But for everybody who's listening, I cannot urge you enough to support the legislation that Katy referred to about changing who's on the parole board. Changing who's on the parole board is only a small step, but it's an incredibly necessary step to deal with technical violations. We need to have a change of culture, a change of philosophy. We need to have a parole board that has people who have been on parole on it. We need to have a parole board that has more people of color on it. We need to have a parole board that wants to understand what people need to succeed in the community and use their skills to help people succeed, instead of, as we often call it, our parole board just trails them, nails them, and jails them. That's what people say about the Massachusetts Parole Board. We need a parole board that's going to help people succeed and figure out how to do it. And maybe we can do it with some legislative changes, and maybe we can do it with some organizing. Maybe we can copy some of the stuff that is going on in New York State. But we need all of those things because people are needlessly suffering, needlessly staying in prison, needlessly giving up their chances to be able to be out at home free with their families because of their fear of parole. And that shouldn't be happening. So we need to change it. And boy, the folks who are here today have all kinds of good ideas about how to do that. So thank you.
So thank you, Ms. Garin. There has been an overwhelming request for your contact information. So what I want to tell everyone is, she, as I introduced her, she is with the Prisoners' Rights Clinic at Northeastern Law School. So that would be the way to reach Ms. Garin. I want to just remind everyone that tens of thousands of people are sent back to prison each year for technical violations. Let us not forget that. And so for as long as we have brothers and sisters still under the supervision of parole and probation, there is still a fight to go on. And here more than ever, we need all hands on deck. So I want to thank each and every one of you who showed up for this event. Do not stop fighting. Brother Jonathan and Brother Wayne, you encourage us every day. You make us understand what it means to put a human face to the atrocities that continue to go on in this very broken system. And I have to tell you that as a person of faith, I am reminded that it's my duty, when I hear you speak, it is my duty to continue to give voice to the voiceless and to continue to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. So I want to thank you for all of the amazing work that you continue to do. I want to encourage you not to give up the fight. We will be unrelenting as we continue to work for justice for each and every person until they are free, but free indeed. Thank you all very much, and I will see you at some other event. In the meantime, have a very good night, and God bless. Thank you.